Thank you for joining us. We're just going to take a moment or two to let some people join before we start. So we'll start in just a moment. Thank everyone for joining. My name is Kevin Bowling. I'm the Executive Director of the Secular Student Alliance. Just a few housekeeping things before we begin. One, Liz will be doing her presentation, and that will be followed by a Q&A. So if you have questions, please feel free to write those in the Q&A spots or the Q&A tab, and I will be asking those to Liz, and so that we can get as many of those as possible. While we have people joining, if you want to go ahead in the chat, throw your name in the chat and let us know where you're from. We'd like to know sort of who's here, and if you're from an organization or just a location, please feel free to let us know about that. This is the last webinar of our fall quarter, our fall semester series. So we're great to be ending with Liz. We will have next spring semester, we will have another series, so at least monthly movies or monthly webinars for the next season. But we're glad that you could join us here today. I see Mary Taylor. It's great to see you there. Nancy and Bob have been great at coming to a lot of our different webinars. So good to see you guys here as well. Well, again, if you have questions as we're going along, please feel free to put those in the Q&A. We will have time for those at the end of the presentation. But I'm really glad to be here today with Liz. So Liz Reiner Platt is the director of the Law, Rights, and Religion Project at the Columbia Law School. And her presentation today is a progressive vision of religious liberty. Liz, great having you here today. I appreciate you being here.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. And thank you all for taking the time to, am I on?
You're on, please go for it.
Okay,
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure there wasn't more. Okay. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thrilled to be here. And I think in just a moment, Lilia, my colleague, is going to pull up my slideshow. Fantastic. So before diving into the presentation, I'm just going to quickly introduce the Law, Rights, and Religion Project for you, or LRRP. We are a law and policy think tank dedicated to advancing religious liberty, pluralism, and social justice. And we believe in a right to free exercise of religion that protects all religious beliefs and communities, including the non-religious, and believe that religious liberty has to be balanced along with many other constitutional rights in the, I would say, rare circumstances in which they conflict. So we do research, we write reports, we file amicus or friend of the court briefs, we analyze federal and state bills, and just otherwise kind of participate in a lot of different ways in the public conversation around religion and the law. So of course, as Kevin said, I'm going to be speaking today about a progressive, oh, I'm hearing that there's an echo. Is anyone else hearing an echo? Okay, I don't know. I don't have anything near me, so I'm just going to keep speaking until someone tells me otherwise. No, okay, great, fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to be speaking again about advancing a pluralistic and progressive vision of religious liberty. I'm going to start by talking, and I'm going to try to not spend too much time on this because I have a feeling you might be more familiar with this. But I'm going to start by talking about how the Christian right has invested in really a decades-long campaign to capture the meaning and the way we publicly discuss the term religious liberty. And how despite this, religious freedom, I would say rightly remains a really extremely important fundamental right for most Americans. And then I'm going to again talk about the work that LRP has done to advance sort of this alternative religious liberty framework, focusing on a report that we released last year along with the amazing folks at Auburn Seminary called All Faiths and None, A Guide to Protecting Religious Liberty for Everyone. So first, what does religious liberty mean for folks today? As many of you maybe have seen or experienced if you've done advocacy work with SSA or just consuming the news, the very term religious liberty, as it's now being used by policymakers, lawyers, and media articles, has really been increasingly confined to refer to this very narrow set of issues, and really the issues most important to conservative white Christians, that is, issues related primarily to sex, gender, and reproduction. So when you see an article about religious liberty in the news, or you see a law filed that's called, a religious liberty law, it's really going to be about one of those issues primarily. I will say that in recent years, there's also been quite a large focus on religious liberty and COVID regulations, which is something that we actually wrote another report about last spring. It's called We the People. And I think at the end of this, my talk, I'm going to post a bunch of links to the different reports I mentioned. But anyway, for the most part, the primary focus, again, has been on the religious liberty rights of folks with conservative views about sex and gender. And this really warped version of how we discuss religious liberty has been adopted really so completely in the public discourse that it's now been essentially taken at face value, which is how you can see articles calling former Attorney General William Barr, who advocated for the Muslim ban, who said horrible things about atheists, called an advocate for religious rights by a veteran reporter in the front page of the New York Times. And I think another really strong example of this is from a article I got just this weekend, which was theorizing, 6 new potential political parties beyond Democrat and Republican, including a Christian conservative party. And as you can see from that slide, the author said that this new party would be focused on religious liberty and would include folks like Mike Pence and Mike Pompeo, again, in my view, not at all proponents of religious liberty. So how did this kind of transformation of the term religious liberty happen? I'm sure there are many, many factors, but one of the big ones is that the Christian right has invested in making it happen. They've put huge resources in terms of money, the number of organizations, the amount of labor into really taking control of the conversation around religious liberty. So in a study we did a couple years ago, we found that, for example, in 2018, Christian right law and policy nonprofits that state that they're working on religious liberty issues as they define them received 7 times the revenue, held 4 times the assets, and employed 3 times as many people as organizations advancing a more inclusive or progressive version of religious liberty. And in fact, I would say because these Christian right orgs tend to be so much more highly focused on religious liberty than the progressive organizations, that 7-to-1 disparity is quite likely to be an underestimate when it comes to how many resources are actually being devoted to religious liberty issues. So what's the result of this huge disparity in financial investment? Well, it's a huge disparity in the amount of work that gets done in terms of litigation, policy, and media campaigns. So this slide kind of gives you a sense of the enormous scale of recent Christian right legal campaigns, which are again being framed as religious liberty campaigns, but really focus primarily on 3 issues. So, tons and tons of litigation challenging reproductive rights, include especially the ACA contraceptive mandate, The famous one being Hobby Lobby, but there have been cases even by an individual who doesn't want their own health insurance to cover contraception. There have been many, many, many lawsuits involving people with objections to interacting with LGBTQ people in just in a huge variety of ways. So there are the famous wedding vendor cases like Masterpiece Cake Shop, but also discrimination by hotels, high school girls who have objections to playing sports with trans teammates. And recently a couple cases, including one initially successful case involving teachers who refused to call trans students by their proper pronouns, allegedly out of religious liberty. And then the flood of litigation I mentioned, challenging COVID-19 stay-at-home orders by churches and pastors. And now we're seeing, a whole new set of cases challenging vaccine requirements. And to be clear, on this slide, I stopped when I ran out of room, not because that's all the litigation there is. I could probably have 10 more slides like this. So progressive and religious minority groups who advocate for religious liberty haven't been able to engage in litigation campaigns related to that right on nearly the same scale. There's also a really significant disparity in focus and framing. So more conservative groups have very openly, very explicitly framed their work as being about religious liberty, and maybe they engage in a couple other issues, but really their primary focus is religious liberty. And in contrast, progressive groups, a lot of them kind of shy away from using the term religious liberty at all, and will instead use phrases like ending religious discrimination, advocating for church-state separation or pluralism. And they also tend to focus on a much wider variety of issues, including racial and gender justice, immigration, poverty, environmental issues, and many more. And to be clear, this isn't a critique by any means. Those are all incredibly important issues. But again, it's just kind of an explanation for why we're seeing this enormous imbalance. And, I think this difference in focus and framing is really clearly highlighted by this slide, which shows how there are so many large conservative religious denominations that have whole institutes and programs with religious liberty, right there in the title, dedicated to advancing their particular version of what religious liberty means. I wouldn't be able to make that kind of slide for progressive religious denominations or even policy organizations, because even though many of them do have very strong positive stances on particular religious liberty issues, it doesn't get the same kind of priority. And then finally, the conservative movement just has a huge number of groups working in all different ways on advancing, again, their version of religious liberty. So this includes law and policy organizations, huge social and fraternal groups like the Knights of Columbus that encourages its members to engage in politics in many ways, media outlets, publishing houses, dedicated grant makers, all sorts of conservative Christian colleges and universities that often have particular programs training folks on religion, law, and policy, and even some conservative affiliated programs and institutes at very prestigious secular schools, including law schools. And so these groups are all working in different ways to transform how the public talks about religious liberty and how it's protected by law. So in sum, the Christian right is very well funded. It's very highly focused on religious liberty issues and framings, and it just includes a large number and a large variety of different organizations. So I think in this way, it's not terribly surprising that it's been extremely successful. The Christian right has been on basically a 15-year winning streak before the Supreme Court, often with the support of typically liberal justices like Elena Kagan and Stephen Breyer. And of course, this is all but certain to continue with the current court. There have been a lot of laws and policies passed that advance kind of a non-pluralist understanding of religious liberty. And we are gearing for another wave of proposed legislation this session, triggered at least in part by church objections to the COVID stay-at-home orders. And as I've already mentioned, there's just been a very successful capturing of the term religious liberty as you see it in the media and in public discourse. So what do we do about this? Something that I'll admit I hear fairly often is, why even bother trying to like reclaim religious liberty? Why don't we maybe come up with another term? Why don't we just emphasize the importance of equality rights? And my sort of response to this is religious liberty is a pluralistic, progressive value. It's not one that we can or we should give up on. And then another reason we really can't see the discourse around religious freedom is that we do live in a country that's both very religious and that values religious liberty highly. So a 2018 Pew study found that 90% of Americans believe in God or some higher power. And it is certainly true that the number of nuns, people with no affiliation with any particular religious group, the number of nuns has been growing very rapidly. And this is a really, really important change. But it's also important to remember that this community, while they may not have ties to any particular denomination, it doesn't mean that they necessarily don't hold religious beliefs or values. So about 2/3 of nuns, by the latest numbers I've seen, still believe in God or a higher power. And interestingly, nearly half report that disagreement with church positions on political and social issues was an important reason for their lack of religious affiliation. People across the political spectrum hold really deep religious and spiritual identities. And the majority of LGB, I don't think T was included in that study, which is why I'm not saying that. The majority of LGB people believe in God or a higher power. And moreover, another recent study found that 80% of Americans say that religious freedom issues are important to them. And again, so 80% of folks think it's really important, and the Christian right is the loudest voice in the room when it comes to defining what religious liberty means and laying out a vision. So rather than ceding religious liberty as a political issue to the right, and also recognizing that the American public understands how deeply important this right is, we at LLRP have been engaging in some deep thinking over the past few years to try to lay out an alternative for what religious liberty should mean, how we should be protecting it in a way that isn't just focused on this really narrow set of issues, just coming together to provide a robust alternative vision. So part of that has been broadening what the public thinks about when they hear religious liberty. So in 2019, for example, we wrote a report called Whose Faith Matters: The Fight for Religious Liberty Beyond the Christian Right, that gave a really sweeping overview of religious liberty lawsuits brought by religious folks associated with a whole bunch of different social justice and humanitarian movements. So the report covered some older groups like the Clergy Consultation Service on Abortion, which was a group of mostly Protestant and Jewish, but also some Catholic religious leaders who helped people find safe ways to get an abortion in the years prior to Roe v. Wade. And a couple of those clergy members actually ended up bringing lawsuits arguing that they had a religious right to provide that kind of help and information to pregnant people. But the report also covered a lot of more recent lawsuits. So claims brought by anti-war protesters, by Native American groups seeking to protect sacred land from having roads or pipelines built on it, clergy members who wanted to perform same-sex marriages out of their deeply held beliefs back when this was illegal in some states, and just a whole bunch of other cases across kind of a really wide range of religious groups and issues. And another kind of related part of our work is trying to make it clear to the judiciary that they can't, or at least they shouldn't, grant really, really broad religious rights to folks with conservative religious beliefs while denying them to other religious adherents. So over the past few years, we've also been consulting and writing amicus briefs in a few religious liberty lawsuits, including cases involving, for example, some volunteers who are pictured on the slide with the faith-based humanitarian group called No More Deaths in Arizona, who had some members who were federally prosecuted, and one of whom faced 20 years in prison essentially for leaving out food and water for undocumented people crossing the border. And they defended themselves based on their religious liberty rights. We also worked with a multi-faith organization called Safe House, which has been working to try and open a safe injection site for people who use injection drugs. And so that, there's someone on site to get someone medical help if they overdose. And Safe House considers themselves to be, again, a faith-based and faith-motivated organization. So they're doing that out of their deeply held religious beliefs. And we also worked with a group of Catholics who were arrested for breaking into a US nuclear facility and performing a religious ceremony that included pouring out vials of their own blood in protest of nuclear weapons. So our approach in these cases, for the most part, has been to file briefs on behalf of neither party. So instead of saying, we think this person should get a religious exemption or this person shouldn't get a religious exemption, essentially, we've just been laying out the current legal framework for religious liberty law and saying, look, these faith practitioners need to be treated as seriously as claimants who oppose contraception or LGBTQ rights. You can't vastly expand the protections for particular religious beliefs and then deny them to others without some very compelling reason. And then last year, we sort of used that Whose Faith Matters report as a jumping off point to partner with Auburn Seminary, which is a multi-faith justice organization, to publish a report that thought through really the whole religious liberty landscape of all these countless different beliefs, different claims, and tried to articulate 6 underlying principles for protecting religious liberty for everybody. So these 6 principles were distilled from just reading, countless different religious liberty opinions from the past 50 years, but they were also informed by a series of convenings we did with diverse groups of attorneys, advocates, and faith leaders over the course of a few years. So I'll just go ahead and go over these 6 principles. The first one is that religious liberty has to be neutral. In other words, the government can't be singling out certain theological communities or beliefs for special persecution or for special protection. It has to remain neutral when it comes to issues of religion and theology. So some policies that we mentioned in the report as potentially violating the neutrality rule include certainly any laws targeting Muslims, most obviously the Muslim ban, but also others in the areas of immigration, criminal justice, and counterterrorism. And also laws that provide special rights only to people who hold particular religious beliefs about an issue. So for example, there are a whole bunch of federal and state laws that say, if you believe that abortion is wrong and you work at a hospital where it's provided, you have a right under your religious beliefs to opt out. But the same laws don't protect, the reverse situation. They don't protect people who feel religiously obligated to provide comprehensive healthcare, including abortion, but work at a hospital where this isn't allowed. So that kind of lopsided religious exemption is, in our view, essentially the government taking a non-neutral stance on what religious beliefs are worthy of and deserving of protection. And so that would violate the neutrality principle. The second principle we came up with is religious liberty has to be non-coercive. So, the whole point of having religious liberty protections is to allow everyone to follow their own conscience, rather than being coerced to comply with the religious beliefs, either of a government official or of your fellow citizens. So, this rule is very obviously violated if a government actor, like say a teacher or a judge, forces you to say a prayer or to engage in some other religious activity. But we show that the non-coercion principle is also violated when the government passes a law that effectively conscripts someone into bearing the cost of a religious belief or a religious practice that they haven't freely chosen. So for example, if there's a religious exemption where I am forced to give up my legal right to a non-discriminatory workplace in order to accommodate my boss's religious beliefs, that's requiring me to subsidize with my rights religious beliefs that I don't hold. And this would violate our non-coercion principle. The third principle is that religious liberty has to be non-discriminatory. So civil rights laws that ban religious discrimination have, over the past 50 or so years, they've reduced religious segregation. They've enabled people of all faiths to fully participate in civil society. And of course, are inordinately important, in particular to religious minorities. So when you hear about policies that are enacted in the name of religious liberty, but they undermine the enforcement of civil rights laws that prohibit religious discrimination, those kinds of measures are going to ultimately harm the ability of religious minorities to openly practice their faith without fear of facing discrimination in employment, in education, housing, public accommodations. And to give kind of a concrete example of this, the focus in the kind of famous Masterpiece Cake Shop case was on the baker's refusal to make a wedding cake for same-sex couples. But in oral arguments, the attorney representing the baker made it very clear that she believed that baker should also have the right to deny services based on a customer's specific religious identity. So, no wedding cakes for Jews, for interfaith couples, for Muslims or atheists. And so, while I'll concede that might increase that particular baker's religious rights, I think allowing that kind of religious discrimination and allowing that kind of religious segregation in our public sphere is just a really awful way to go about trying to protect religious liberty overall. Our fourth principle is religious liberty cannot be absolute. And this one, honestly, should be kind of a no-brainer. No constitutional right is absolute. And, in the kind of classic goofy law school example is no one believes that there should be a right to engage in human sacrifice, right? So, when there are other really important government interests or really important constitutional rights at stake, we can place limits on religious liberty. And our court system knows this. Our court system denies requests for religious exemptions all the time, especially when they're brought by people requesting accommodations in prison, unsurprisingly. So it's not that courts don't understand that religious liberty does have to have some limits. Fifth, we say that religious liberty must be democratic. So right now, rather than equally protecting the religious beliefs of all individuals, or, in the case of a direct conflict, protecting the religious rights of communities with less social or political power, a lot of religious exemptions sort of do the opposite. So they'll prioritize the faith of individuals and even like for-profit companies that are already overrepresented in the democratic process. So, there'll be protections for big companies and for employers over workers and consumers. I think if anything, we should be doing the opposite, taking special care to protect the religious beliefs of those with kind of the least power and influence over the way our laws get enacted. And in particular, I think we should be especially wary of religion laws that serve to essentially weaken regulations over really powerful institutions. So, for example, religious exemptions that strip the right to collective bargaining away from workers at religious institutions. Those kinds of exemptions have been granted at a whole bunch of religious colleges and universities in response to staff members trying to organize. And then finally, religious liberty has to be pluralistic. And this, again, goes to the issue of not conflating religious liberty with conservative Christianity, even if we're doing so, unintentionally, which I think sometimes happens. And specifically, I say it's really critical that conversations around religious liberty really try to highlight the voices and the experiences of religious minorities. That includes the non-religious, religious communities of color, basically everyone who is not the focus of these conversations right now. And I also think we need to really reject this sort of very common religion versus LGBTQ rights or religion versus reproductive rights framework for understanding and describing religious liberty issues. There are many, many people for whom their religious liberty is not in conflict with reproductive justice and LGBTQ equality. And so I think positioning the protection of religion and other fundamental rights in this sort of zero-sum conflict tends to really erase the experiences of many faith communities, including, LGBTQ people of faith. And I think it also brushes over the fact that the right to make your own religious and moral decisions about how you live your life, about your sexual and family life, without this fear of losing your home or your job, it is an equality right, but it's not just that. It's also itself essential to having your own sort of religious rights and your own freedom of conscience. So, I will also finally just note that in addition to the more legislative all faiths and none report that we also did a media guide for journalists who write about these religious liberty issues that I, really love for anyone who has contacts with media. Just spread that piece out widely. And that is my talk. I think, is my email address up yet? No, not quite. Okay, that's my email address. Again, thanks so much for your attention. And I think we're gonna go to Q&A now. And look out if anyone of you want to read the any of the reports I mentioned, they're going to be dropped in the chat momentarily.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Liz. I think there was, I think while we know that there is this disparity in resources, when you laid it out, I was like, wow. I was honestly looking for my camera to go, I need to take a picture. But yeah, I think that's really interesting. I'd love for you just to, I like that you talked about at the end and the different shoes. And as you were talking about it, I was looking at it, I think, from a bit the other side, and looking at as the secular community, how are we portraying communities of religion and their ability to practice their religion. And I think one thing that, I had to flip it around for myself as you were talking about it. But I think one thing that we are constantly looking at is, and especially over the last four years, is really Christian nationalism. And so conflating a bit the conservative religious community and sort of, it's, while claiming to want religious liberty, really just for themselves. And so I think that your framework is really crucial. I wonder how it fits in with currently what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think the hope was that it sort of is a direct response to that warping, that intentional warping of religious liberty, I would say. That's why I think, the report, I feel like it's very important. I think, one thing I was maybe expecting from the Q&A is like, this feels maybe that, like, does this feel really unrealistic given how unbelievably conservative our Supreme Court and to some extent our larger judiciary is right now? And I think I really see our report is looking, the Christian right took decades to build its movement. And I think we need to engage in this really long-term vision. We need to have something to kind of hope for and to look for. And that's really the purpose of the document. So, do I think the 6 principles are going to convince, dominionists and Christian nationalists? No, including perhaps those in seats of power. I don't, but I still hope that it provides kind of just a useful way to get out of the same ruts of the way we think about these issues.
And it's, I'm trying to find a different word besides litmus test, but it does, I think the 6 principles help us define, help us set up categories in which to sort of critically think about the situation that's taking place and be able to put it up against some criteria. How does this impact religious liberty, and sort of, so I really like the model that you have. And I like being able to use that to sort of critically think about different situations and look at, is this a religious liberty issue or not? And while I agree, I don't think you're going to convince any hardcore Christian nationalists that, let's abandon what we've been doing. But I think if more and more progressive religious groups and progressive groups start having a better way to talk about religious liberty and reclaiming it a little bit, we start to change the narrative that all of us are using. And I don't think Christian nationalists get away with as much as what they're doing. So we do have a question from Rick Gold. He said, how has the Christian right used religious liberty as justification to promote voting restrictions?
Yeah. So I think, I think think the best example I can think of for that is I have seen, so it's certainly not the prime, I would not say religious liberty is by any means the primary kind of language that's being used around voting restrictions. That said, I have seen it. And I think what often happens with a lot of different laws is, the conservative movement will find like one little piece of a legislation that could conceivably impact religious liberty. And that becomes sort of the hook to say, okay, we need to throw out the entire legislation or the entire issue. So the thing that I thought of was like, there was Hans von Spakovsky, who's a very famous anti-voting rights thinker and advocate, was going around saying for a while that there's one provision, one teeny tiny piece of for the People Act, where people on voting commissions have to disclose any kind of organization that they're affiliated with, just in order to prevent like conflicts of interest. A pretty routine thing. It doesn't single out religion. You'd have to say every group you're a part of, just so they know the people who are drawing these whatever districting lines, I think it was. We know if they have a conflict of interest. And so his talking point for a while was saying, well, this is clearly a horrible assault on religious liberty, because anyone who goes to church is not going to be able to do redistricting because they're going to have to say where they go to church or something. And it's just absurd. I mean, like the idea that we're not going to choose Christians to be members of, to have seats in office, when you look at how like overrepresented they are in every political, I mean, it's a clearly absurd argument. But that was sort of that one little hook to say, it's not like he wanted to change that one provision of the For the People Act. He wants to tank the bill. And that's one way to do it. And I think that is something that you can see in a lot of different issues, whether that's, a group like, ALEC, for example, which is not a religious liberty group. They're just kind of an anti-regulation group, kind of business centric, filing a brief I don't even remember the case, but filing a brief on behalf of religious liberty, really not necessarily because they care deeply about religious liberty rights, but because it's a really convenient way to throw out, an entire way of regulating businesses, because they just want, as little regulation on big corporations as possible, right? And then I saw someone in the chat mentioned the thing about voting on Sundays, and yeah, there was also that kind of goofy comment. Was it Marjorie Taylor Greene? I can't remember who it was. The person in the chat can remind me of who it was, said something about like, yeah, there shouldn't be souls to the poll. Like we should have the voting polls closed on Sundays or something. That also happened.
Well, I think even in the Virginia race, the Democrats, the vice presidents, there were a few very high caliber people specifically making videos to be shown in churches. So, while that perhaps is a little less obvious, I think and I think many people in the secular community is like, wait a second, like, religious liberty is important, but we also have the separation of church and state. And so we shouldn't be using doing messaging directed specifically at, Christian churches to go out and vote. While it's important, but the messaging, like that messaging was made specifically for that. And so I think for me, it was very much a violation of a separation of state and church. Mary C. asked, she says, this was at the very beginning of the presentation. She says, has Lemon and Kurtzman in 1971 and then modified in 1987 still relevant, or has it sort of been decimated as some people claim?
Oh boy. Right, it keeps popping back up, right? But at this point, I mean, the Establishment Clause is basically a shell. I would say, people, you can still keep making the argument. It's not been formally overturned. And Lemon v. Kurtzman is a three-part, for folks who don't know, it's a three-part test for determining when government acts violate the Establishment Clause. And it says, I do not have it at the tippy top of my brain, but it's essentially that actions of the government, can't specifically advance religious interests. They have to have a secular purpose, and something else. At this point, right, like what secular purpose is a 40-foot cross on federal land serving? So if you're asking if it's been formally overturned, I'm fairly certain the answer is no. If you're asking how important it is for current Establishment Clause, jurisprudence, I think the answer is not very.
Clearly with the Secular Student Alliance, we're working with lots of students all across the country. And I think in your graph, while we have religious students who are members of the organization and students who would identify as a complete none, our core is really sort of your atheist agnostics, sort of in that paradigm. For them, with the sort of the progressive vision and the definition of religious liberty, what's your message to them?
Yeah, I think my message to them would be like, you need religious liberty. Religious liberty is incredibly important for you. And that, this framework does our best to recognize that. And I think things like the, non-coercion principle is something that is very much, maybe not the precise language that is used the non-coercion principle, that does appear. I think that term was actually taken from a lot of Establishment Clause cases, many of which have been brought by secular groups. So yeah, I think my message would be like, this framework is intended. Like, I think religious liberty is not the liberty to be religious. Religious liberty should be the ability to make decisions about whether or not you're religious, how you're religious, when you're religious, what that means for you.
I appreciate that. You got a nice little thank you in the comments. So just want to acknowledge that. So as a former, evangelical pastor and leader, so that's very nice to have out there.
Yeah, thank you.
We just got from Mary asked, Gorgeous said that the Constitution took a holiday during the pandemic, but it shouldn't be just a sabbatical. What about Supreme Court cases decided without hearings in a shadow court? What about Supreme Court cases decided?
What about the shadow docket?
Yes.
Oh boy, what about it? So you might be interested in our We the People of Faith report, which is a really deep dive into all the COVID litigation, many of which was decided on the shadow docket. And certainly I think it's a disturbing trend. I think there's a reason that we have public oral arguments and decisions on the record and all of that stuff, so we kind of know what's actually happening with the law and why. So I think it's a problematic trend. I think maybe some of the absolute most extreme streams of what happened on the shadow docket in the COVID cases have been very, very, very marginally walked back in the Fulton decision. But not very much, honestly. The Fulton decision still essentially said that, because there was this, and Fulton, I'm sorry, is a case, for those who don't know, regarding whether a foster care agency that receives public funds can be held to a requirement that they not discriminate against same-sex couples seeking to adopt. So, and what the court ruled was that because there was this provision in the contract that essentially said that the city can kind of make individualized decisions exempting, like there can be individualized exemptions from placing children with parents in a non-discriminatory manner, even though that exemption had never been used. That meant that if the state could not enforce an anti-discrimination provision the agencies. It's a little, I feel like I'm not being clear, but that's also because it's a very garbled, incoherent case. Yeah, so I mean, I would say that there's certainly an argument to be made, and I understand that for a lot of litigators, it's very important that a case be described in a way that's as narrow as possible. I understand that, but to me personally, as an academic, it feels like a little bit of a distinction without a difference from the kind of extreme kinds of exemptions and standards that were adopted in the COVID cases. I don't want to take up too much time. I mean, I feel like it explains a little bit more in the We the People. It's like a 40-page report. So if you really want everything I have to say on that, you can read that.
Yeah, I think there's lots of interest in the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Clearly with the current makeup, what has taken place already, and just the potential. And I think as you sort of, with the success over the last 15 years, I think now that the court sees it's a highly favorable court for them, they are intentionally pushing as many things through as possible, starting, trans issues, women's reproductive health, LGBT. I mean, I think we will continue to see more and more and more from that. Alan wrote, he says, is Project Blitz still a thing, or has it been replaced by religious freedom? And does religious freedom have a formal agenda as Project Blitz did?
I would say they're part and parcel of the same thing. I wouldn't say that, I think Project Blitz is sort of maybe the latest iteration or a iteration of this longer campaign towards religious liberty. If I had to place kind of a starting point in this new way that the right has been framing religious liberty, I might say like the Manhattan Declaration, which was essentially a sign-on letter from I don't want to say the wrong thing, the early 2000s, I think, that was basically said the new focus of conservative religious denominations is going to be marriage, abortion, and religious liberty. But really, religious liberty is just marriage and abortion. So it's kind of again, a bit of a distinction without a difference. But so I think that's when you start to see real explosion in framing those first two issues as religious liberty issues. Not to say that it wasn't done before, it certainly was. But I think that was, if you wanted to pick maybe a starting point for the real conservative, the real conservative effort to change this public dialogue on it, I might say then. So Project Blitz is still a thing. It has a new name. The person who is kind of the absolute expert in all things Project Blitz would be Frederick Clarkson at Public Research Associates. And he's written a ton about Project Blitz, and it is still it's still a thing. It does have a new name, and I'll say, again, I want to be inclusive for everyone who doesn't know what Project Blitz is. It is a legislative playbook that was created by a handful of Christian right groups, including Wall Builders and I think the Congressional Prayer Caucus, if I recall correctly. And it doesn't include anything related to reproductive health because there's already a ton of, the National Right to Life, National Right to Life Association, Commission, whatever. The National Right to Life folks already have tons of model legislation related to abortion and repro stuff. So this really focused on bills like the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA, and also anti-LGBTQ religious liberty legislation. And it was essentially really a playbook for state legislatures of saying, okay, and it had 3 levels of legislation. The first being the bills that they considered to be the easiest to pass to kind of get their foot under the door. So it would be things like putting a sign with the 10 Commandments in schools or something like that, something where they thought they could get more kind of conservative Democrats on board, and did get conservative Democrats on board in some states. And then, there would be level 2, and then level 3 was the really hard-hitting legislation that like created these meaningful exemptions from civil rights and other kinds of legislation. And it was, it's been around for, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years or something, maybe less. Time is a blur in COVID times. But yes, anyway, so yes, that it is still a thing. Also, I'll note that if you remember in 2015, there was a huge, really contentious battle over a proposed Religious Freedom Restoration Act in Indiana under then Governor Mike Pence. And then there was kind of a lull, and there were a few years when there were no RFRAs passed. And then last year, we actually saw 2 new RFRAs get passed again. So I think, I don't know if it's the influence of the Supreme Court, if it's now that, Biden's in office, people are feeling like real revved up to pass new laws. I don't know what necessarily, or maybe it's like the influence, again, this kind of backlash to the COVID regulations, but it seems like there's seems to be another really big push to pass new Religious Freedom Restoration Acts, which are these super broad religious exemption laws. And they also don't seem to be getting as much attention as the 2015 Indiana fight did.
And one, I think being an organization with a secular community, I mean, we Freedom from Religion Foundation, American Atheist, Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, American Human Association, fortunately, I think are all really working hard to not only represent non-religion, but also just religious freedom for minority religions, LGBT people, and so forth. I said we are hoping to hear back shortly. We American Atheist and Americans United filed lawsuit on our behalf and an individual student against the Trump administration, and particularly DeVos with Department of Education allowing religious students to be able to discriminate and receive funds, public student funds. So we are hoping to hear shortly back from the Biden administration about they wanted to look at it and the possibility of rescinding that. So we are hoping to hear back fairly shortly that an article or so is that they're going to rescind that, so we can end that. So, well, good. Well, I really want to thank you. I really appreciate your time today and sharing a little bit of your expertise and about the Columbia law and the project that you're working with. I would say your website is loaded with lots and lots and lots of good information. So I know we put some of the links in the chat. We'll be sending out an email with this video, and we'll try to include as many links as we can to additional information for everybody. So thank you so much, Liz. Really appreciate you being here, and hope you have a good rest of the day.
You too. Thanks, everyone.